Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I truly appreciate it. Very excited about today's episode. I'm going to be exploring my favorite aspect of ufology. This subject is always very popular, and it is onboard UFO encounters. The title of today's episode is We Are Your Friends, 8 Incredible Onboard UFO Encounters. I have 8 cases today, 2 from outside of the United States and 6 from within the United States. The locations include Argentina, Australia, Maine, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Texas, Tennessee, and West Virginia. These cases date from 1977 to 2014. They involve all different types of ETs, some really interesting and unique interactions. The vast majority of these are fully conscious UFO encounters. Only one involves the use of hypnosis, and frankly, it stands up without it. These kinds of experiences are not nearly as uncommon as people might think. J. Allen Hynek is quoted as saying that 1 in 40 people have had a UFO encounter. That's actually what got me to start asking everyone I know, and I found about 4 or 5 people within my own circle of family, friends, and coworkers. I've certainly had one. I think my older brother has as well, and my younger sister. It's funny because in 1991, the Roper organization did a poll and found that 1 in 50 people show the markers of having an onboard UFO encounter. So my point is, it's far more common, and that makes it very important. I think these cases deserve a lot of attention. So let's just get started. First case I'd like to talk about today, I call We Are Your Friends. This one occurred on November 12, 1968 in Blackwood, New Jersey. This is a multiple witness case. It does involve some limited amount of physiological reactions, but it's truly an astonishing case because this person did recall this without the aid of hypnosis, and it's got some really interesting aspects to it. Again, this case involves 2 witnesses, though only one has come forward, and it took him 42 years to do so. He is anonymous, so I'll just call him Aiden. His friend's name is Paul, that is his friend's real name. On November 12, 1968, Aiden and Paul were just young kids, and they were out walking together in the suburb of Turnersville. This is located in Washington Township, New Jersey, located immediately north of Blackwood, where they lived. And while walking, they noticed a glowing ball of light floating along the tree line. This is at night. Both were puzzled because the object was totally silent. They became even more concerned when it seemed to be tracking them, following them as they walked. And after a few moments of this, they panicked and, quote, ran like hell. As Aiden says, I do not remember much after that. And for 28 years or so, that's where the matter rested. But everything changed when one evening Aiden was watching the television show Sightings, which is of course about people who've had UFO encounters. The program featured a glowing orb, and that was all it took. As Aiden says, bang, I remembered. This time he remembered not only seeing the orb, noticing that it was following them and running like hell, but he recalled that it continued to follow him and even more. As Aiden says in his own words, Paul and I ran to the corner of the streets, Whitman Drive and Cornwall Terrace. Then a blue light beam came out of the orb and froze us right where we stood. The next thing I remember was not being able to move, like frozen, but not being cold. Next, I was on a table, flat. I raised my head and saw Paul on the table across the room. However, it was unlike any room I have ever been in, before or since. It had no walls. A brilliant white light was inside it. 2 beings were standing over me. I looked at my friend Paul, and I saw them leaning over him as well. Now, Aiden does not describe the beings in any real detail, except to say that there were 4 of them, 2 by his table and 2 by Paul's table. 2 of the beings were tall and 2 were shorter, and he also said that they were not human-looking and that he believes they were male. The experience, all in all, he said, was pretty upsetting. And as he says, as I got upset, the taller one standing over me touched my forehead. I went limp as a dish rag, and all of my thoughts were calmed. So now relaxed, Aiden began to talk to the taller being and asked him, "Who are you?" The tall being replied, "We are your friends." Paul asked him, "Why do you look so different?" The being just repeated, "We are your friends." So Paul asked him, "Why?" And the being replied, "It is necessary." Now none of this communication was verbal, but instead all telepathic, or as Paul says, struggling to verbalize this, not with speech, but all mentally. So he saw the beings near Paul turning him over and yelled out to his friend, "Watch out." At this point, the being next to Aiden again touched him on the forehead and Aiden passed out. He woke up shortly later, and as Aiden says, "The last thing I remember was him telling me never to tell anyone about this." The next thing Aiden knew, as he says, they dropped us both off, unharmed and fully clothed. Aiden later did find a spot or incision on his lower spine, which he connects to this experience. But another strange event did occur the day after this encounter. Aiden was woken up by the sounds of a military helicopter hovering over his home, so he went outside and was confronted by a tall man wearing a black rimmed hat, much like a policeman would wear, he said. And Aiden asked the man what happened last night, and the man replied, quote, "It's not safe, little boy. An escaped convict broke out of jail." Now, Aiden doesn't believe this. In hindsight, and learning about the subject of UFOs, he now wonders if this was a government agent or the so-called men in black. Whatever the case, he is now convinced that he was, in fact, taken on board a craft. He also has vague memories of learning how the ETs live and says that they have no wars. And as he says, all this information was flooded into me. Says Aiden, "I had lost time. There is a spot or incision on my lower spine. I am 100% sure of what happened, but it took to see it on TV to jog my memory of the event." Years later, curious about what his friend Paul remembered, he tracked him down 29 years after the event and learned that his friend was now in jail. So Aiden wrote a letter to him, not mentioning the UFO incident, as he didn't want to ask about it right off the bat. And to his surprise, Paul wrote back. So Aiden wrote another letter asking if Paul had any memory of the strange UFO encounter, and weirdly, the letter came back unopened with a notice that Paul was, quote, "unable to be found." To me, the most interesting aspect of that case is how the witness recalled his encounter. It took him years to remember it, but he did, spontaneously. And what's so interesting is that it took a trigger or a cue. We see this many times. Something will remind a person of their encounter, and suddenly all the memories come flooding back. And that's exactly what happened in this case. He also apparently does have a mark on his body which helps him to confirm his experience, but it's truly an extraordinary encounter of an onboard UFO experience. And there are so many. Let's go to the next one. This one is also super interesting. I call this one, "We Were Not Afraid." This one is another multiple witness case which occurred on September 27, 1974 in Jindabyne, Australia. This one was professionally investigated by an experienced researcher, and it's super interesting. To me, we'll get to it, but the most interesting aspect of this case is how the witness was affected afterwards. This case comes from prominent Australian UFO researcher Mark Moravec and was published in the Volume 5, Number 5 issue of the UFO Research Australia newsletter. The case involves two men, although only one has come forward, and their names are known by the researchers but have not been released. So I'll call the primary witness Todd. He was 11 years old at the time of his encounter, and his friend, age 19, agreed to take him out to go hunting at night in the Snowy Mountains area just a few kilometers from Jindabyne in New South Wales, Australia. It was 9 p.m., September 27, 1994, a very cold night. They had been walking around for some time when they both noticed a bright white spherical light, which appeared to be sitting on the ground about 800 meters away. Its apparent size was quite large, about twice that of the full moon, but they estimated that its actual size was maybe 3 meters across, 9 or 10 feet. Although it was very bright, strangely, it did not appear to cast much light onto the surrounding environment. So together they speculated about what it might be, perhaps the light from a farmer. They considered going to investigate, but it was too cold and a bit too far away. Instead, they just watched it for about a half an hour before leaving the area. The next day, they did go back to this site to investigate and were surprised to see that there was nothing there. No structures, no roads, no evidence at all that anything had been there. But later that night, the two young men were with several other friends in the area when they saw the same or similar object again and watched it for more than an hour. But strangely, nobody seemed to give the light much attention. Now, it was about 9 years after all of this that Todd began to have really vivid flashbacks about that night. Memories that this was far more than just the sighting of an unexplained light, but that it was in fact a spacecraft of some kind and that he and his friend had been taken on board and examined by apparent extraterrestrials. Thinking back to that evening and piecing together the events, he realized that they had some missing time as well. As Todd says, "I realized that after seeing the light, there was a time lapse of some 2 hours. I would remember bits and pieces of our walk, but it was so dreamlike compared to the memories I was having. I was not asleep. I saw myself and my friend approach the light, but we weren't walking. We were wrapped in a blue light ourselves." So Todd says that they were pulled towards this object by this light, and as this was occurring, all the wildlife in the area, which was considerable, became completely quiet. In fact, all they could hear was a low whistling hum coming from the craft. And as they got closer, a door opened and they saw tall, thin, gray-skinned entities floating outside the opening. And the next thing Todd knew, they were being taken on board. As Todd says, "We floated in a doorway into a complex room of tubes and benches. We were laid on a table. All the while, tall, thin beings with arms and legs, long fingers with no joints, smooth gray skin, and smooth, noseless faces watched and kind of squirmed, like when we are waiting in a queue." Todd says that he saw 4 beings on board. 3 examined him, while a 4th moved in and out of the room as if checking on their progress. He says the beings were over 6 feet tall, very thin, with bald heads, and where the eyes would be, this is so bizarre, Todd said he saw only, quote, "gray bulges." He said that he couldn't see any ears, but that their noses were flat and their mouths were slit-like. He couldn't really tell if they were wearing any clothing or not, but if they were, it was definitely skin-tight. And although they seemed to float while outside the craft, while inside they moved with large steps and were very flexible in their movements. The beings never spoke audibly, but it seemed to Todd that they were communicating with gestures. He also said that when the beings touched them, he could feel that their hands were very warm. And he also got a pretty good look at the room they were in. As he says, "The room was gray-blue, and a bluish light seemed to emanate from the corners of the walls and the ceiling. The room was cramped and square. The beings had just enough room to get in between us and around us. They had cream-colored overhead lights to look at us with. We lay there, and we could see them lean over us. They hooked up wires to our skin and seemed to be able to pull our clothes open without tearing them. They seemed very busy at the time, and often would look at each other and pass instruments from one another." Todd says that he also saw benches and cupboards with shelves which held various instruments inside the craft. He also noticed what appeared to be a panel of red and yellow lights flashing on and off, but the whole purpose of the encounter seemed to be to examine the 2 young men. As Todd says, "As far as I could interpret, they were gauging how electromagnetic fields related to my body and the atmosphere. I remember my friend came around and tried to resist, but they took him away only to return him. His eyes were sunken, he was very pale, and very cooperative. He passed out once he lay down. The tests went on for some time, and after literally hundreds of wires had been connected, they just took them off, closed up my clothes, and left us both. We were not afraid, but we were not really conscious either. They put us back where we had first seen them, and that was that." So Todd estimates that they were on board the craft for about 2 hours. They didn't regain full awareness until they walked across a ridge and saw a horse. Now, he did have one bizarre dream following all this that he thinks might be related to the encounter, because during the time he was remembering this event, he dreamt that he and his friend were in the craft and looking outside, saw that the craft had landed on a pad of ice, kind of reminded him of the North Pole. Inside the craft, he was taken into a strange kind of void where he had a spiritual type experience. He said he had the body of a fox and was running around hunting small animals until a man dressed in furs grabbed him and pulled him from the snow. So that was a dream which he feels was related, but he's not sure how it fits in. His recall of the onboard segment, however, came as flashbacks. Ultimately, it was not really a positive experience for him, and he said that he felt as if he had been violated and, quote, used like some specimen and dumped. And he became very upset thinking about these beings. He believes he was able to recall the experience because at the time he had started doing transcendental meditation, and this is when all the memories came back. Now, another very interesting result of the encounter was that he became interested in the math and physics of time and space, and of course in UFOs as well. He also reports having strong intuition and premonitions of upcoming events, and on one occasion saw an apparition of what he believes was a ghost. He works as a professional musician and describes himself as a stable, intuitive person with a good understanding of human consciousness. Researcher Mark Moravec writes that Todd was, quote, a sincere and stable person with no obvious indication of a hoax or pathological problems. Though Mark, the researcher, is not necessarily convinced that this involves a physical onboard experience, the witness is. He is absolutely convinced that this was a real experience and that he and his friend were physically taken on board the craft. Here we have another case of a witness who remembered the onboard segment of his encounter years after it occurred. And he did it through, apparently, the use of meditation. This is something I always recommend to people who are perhaps seeking hypnotic regression. First, write down everything you remember and then try meditating to bring back your encounter. And certainly that was successful, apparently, for this witness. To me, another really interesting aspect of this case is how he became so psychically aware following his encounter, with premonitions and ghost sightings and precognition. This is a very prominent pattern among UFO contactees. I think it really speaks to what the ETs are trying to do here, which is wake us up to our own psychic abilities. So, an all-around interesting case. Now let's move to the next one. This one is, again, all these cases really interesting. But this one has some unique aspects to it. It is technically a single witness case, but there were two other people there who saw the UFO, so I'm going to call it a multiple witness case. I call this one Come Into the Ship. This one occurred one evening in July of 1977 in Elliott, Maine. As far as I know, it hasn't been formally investigated, but it's a really remarkable encounter because this witness very nearly did not recall, but he did. The main witness in this case is William Cole. He has come forward and allowed his real name to be used. He was about 28 years old at the time of his encounter and currently works as a marketing executive. He has a BA in communications and philosophy and says that from a very young age he had always been interested in science and space travel, but nothing could have prepared him for the events of one evening in July of 1977. The encounter began when William woke up in the bedroom of his home in Elliott, Maine, to see a strange light behind the trees. His girlfriend was asleep beside him in bed, and looking out the window, he was amazed to see a craft rising above the trees and hover there. And, as William says, I could hear a message in my thoughts that my desire for proof of extraterrestrials had arrived, and that I was not to tell anyone. It was definitely telepathic communication, and I asked silently if I could tell my woman. The reply was something like, if you want to. So I woke her up and asked her to look out the window and tell me what she could see. She described exactly what I saw. Now, this was so amazing to William that he was still wondering if he might be dreaming, and actually pinched himself, shook his head, and asked his girlfriend if they might be dreaming. But it was clear to them both that they were not. By now, this craft was landing very close to the house, or coming close to landing. William asked her if she could hear any messages coming from the craft, and she replied, "It's telling us not to tell anyone, and that we can come onto the ship." As William says, "That's what I was perceiving also, so I jumped out of bed and started putting on my clothes. She put her robe on. I was out in the upstairs hall and headed down the stairs." Now at this point, William's girlfriend said that she had to tell her roommate, who was asleep in the other room, about what was happening. And William shouted out, "Don't do it!" And he ran down to the first floor and out into the yard to get a closer look at this craft. He could now see that it was about 30 feet across, disc-shaped, dark gray in color with lights around the rim. He did not see any landing legs. And as William says, "I saw the ship sitting there. There was an open door with a ramp coming out of it. Meanwhile, my girlfriend and roommate were headed downstairs, but I was intent on getting onto the vehicle and not violating the beings who had sent the thoughts by not telling more people. There was a yellowish light coming from the interior, and I could see a tiled wall and what appeared to be a tub filled with liquid at the center of the room." So at this point, William ran up the ramp and into the ship, but as if a switch had been flipped, he had apparent missing time. As William says, "The next thing I remember was standing back in the house near the back door. I rushed back outside, and the UFO was lifting off into the air above the yard. The women were entering the room from the upstairs by this time, and they joined me outside. As I looked up, following its movement high into the air about 150 feet, the object transformed itself into what appeared to be a U.S. Army cargo plane, complete with rumbling engine sound, and proceeded away from the trees. Our roommate said something to the effect that it was just a plane, and I could feel waves of mental energy attempting to block and confuse my mind into a doubtful state. As we stood there in the yard, I resolved not to let my memory be blanked out. We all ended up going to bed. So the next day he remembered what happened, and they talked about it. William's girlfriend said that the whole thing was probably all in their minds, but William heartily disagreed, because he recalled something which left no doubt in his mind that this experience was physically real. As William says, "I know it was a physical, material, real-time experience, because I ran onto that ship with my jeans and a t-shirt on, and I had only underpants on when I found myself back in the house minutes or hours later. What happened inside the ship, I cannot recall, but I remember running up that ramp." About 28 years after the encounter, William did report his experience to the website ufoevidence.org. I think that's a good case. True, the witness doesn't really remember any part of the actual on-board experience, but there's little doubt certainly in his own mind that he was taken on board, because he does remember running into the ship and coming out. His clothes were different, so that's kind of a dead giveaway. That happens quite often. People will come back from an encounter and perhaps their clothes are inside out, or even they're wearing someone else's clothes. It's so interesting to me that he came very close to not remembering any of it, but ultimately did remember. So this again illustrates how there can often be memory problems associated with UFO encounters. Always makes me wonder how many people have had an onboard encounter and don't even remember it. I'm guessing a lot. Let's move to the next case. This one is really interesting to me because it was entirely benevolent. And in fact, I call this one "Not a Single Drop of Fear." That is a direct quote from the primary witness. This case occurred on November 4, 1978, outside of Buenos Aires, Argentina. This does involve 4 witnesses, though apparently only one was taken on board, and he got to meet human-looking ETs. While this case does involve 4 witnesses, apparently only one of them recalls being taken on board. He is anonymous, so I'll just call him Felipe. Summer in Argentina actually runs from December to February, and it was a clear summer night on November 4, 1978. Felipe and 3 other friends were driving in a truck in the Buenos Aires area of Argentina. Felipe sat in the back seat directly behind the driver, and he was looking out the side window when he noticed a strange object hovering low in the sky. was actually moving slowly and looked to be about 100 to 150 feet high off the ground. The craft was round, and he estimates that it was about 200 to 300 feet in diameter. As Philippe says, I told my friend, and we passed by the path of the UFO and stopped in the middle of the road. The UFO was at that time in the 8 o'clock position, meaning due west, and was descending and approaching very slowly to our location. It was huge and soundless. I could see an entity in the lower level. In the middle level, lights were spinning with different colors. When the UFO was getting closer, a yellow light was lighting the area. It was kind of a cloudy yellow. We were observing the UFO until it stopped above our heads, no more than 30 feet high. Now at this point the encounter was just a simple sighting, but it was now about to escalate from a close encounter of the first kind to a close encounter of the fourth kind, being taken on board an extraterrestrial craft. Because, as Philippe says, the next thing I remember was me getting up into the craft in a sort of spiral steps, escorted by an alien behind me, I think to the second level. An alien almost 7 feet tall with blonde hair and a colorful tight uniform was standing up right in front of me on my right side when I reached the floor level. His head was kind of an upside down conical shape. He looked at me with a friendly attitude for a moment, and then he kept on doing whatever he was doing. I saw another entity far away from me on the left side, also engaged in other activity. The room was wide and spacious and kind of self-illuminated. The ceiling had a dome shape, and the color was an intense blue, similar to the sky you can see in the early morning high in the mountains. The one who was escorting me took me across the room and introduced me to a fourth alien. He was sitting down and greeted me with a friendly approach. Now, Philippe did not see any of his friends on board the craft, or at least he didn't say he saw them, but nor was he the least bit afraid. As he says, I remember not having a single drop of fear. He, meaning the extraterrestrial who was escorting him around the craft, talked to me for a while. I could feel how we were moving. I do not know if we were flying or just floating, and after that point, I cannot remember anything else. Philippe does not report on what the ETs told him or if his friends had any memory beyond just seeing the UFO. Such an amazing case. It's interesting because the vast majority of people who are taken on board do report being physically examined. He does not. Basically, he was taken on board and given a tour of the craft. I find that really interesting. Certainly people who do not react with fear or panic often are given a tour of the craft, and the ETs will communicate with them. But when people do react with panic, often that's when they will have missing time, because I don't think it's the ET's goal to scare people, harm them in any way. The evidence does not support that. So that, I think, is a very interesting case because it illustrates this thing that happens to so many people when they're taken on board. All right, let's move to the next case. This one I thought was really profound. I call this one, What Weird Eyes You Have. The witness in this case is just a young teenager. He clearly had quite a traumatic encounter, but it's super interesting. It occurred on December 5, 1980 in Foxborough, Massachusetts. And this one was thoroughly investigated and has physical evidence that really supports the veracity of this encounter. This case was reported directly to researcher Raymond Fowler minutes after it occurred. He handed it over to researcher Joseph Nyman, the Massachusetts chief investigator for MUFON, and MUFON field investigator Edwin W. Fogg, Jr. The witness is a 13-year-old boy whose identity remains a secret, so I'll just call him Steve. That is a pseudonym. It was a bitterly cold evening around 6:30 p.m. as Steve prepared to go to a Boy Scout meeting near his home in Foxborough, Massachusetts. He stepped outside to check on his dirt bike and to make sure that the ground was not too frozen for him to ride the bike. As he was bending over the ground, he suddenly heard a very strange whistling or humming noise, which he said was very similar to the sound of someone rubbing their finger on the rim of a wine glass. And looking up towards the source of the noise, he immediately saw a saucer-shaped object hovering about 50 feet overhead. He estimates that it was about 35 feet in diameter. It had glowing portholes situated around the edge of the craft, and he says it was, quote, bigger than a house. Now, almost immediately, it sent down a beam of light from its base, striking Steve directly on the chest. And Steve says that he felt a tingling sensation in his legs and discovered that he was unable to move. He's really not sure how long he was in this beam of light, but during this time he heard a strange, quote, mumbling in his head. And he felt as if someone was trying to communicate with him telepathically, but he just couldn't understand what they were saying. He felt like he had lost normal consciousness, and at some point, the beam retracted, the paralysis lifted, the craft flew away, and Steve ran into the house screaming to his mother that he had just seen a UFO. So she estimates that he was outside for about 10 minutes, and she had no doubt that Steve had seen something very unusual because, as she says, he was as white as a ghost. She herself believed strongly in UFOs, and in the past had actually worked directly with investigator Raymond Fowler and with MUFON. So it was now time for Steve to go to his Boy Scout meeting, so he left. Meanwhile, his mother contacted Raymond Fowler and told him what happened. Raymond Fowler immediately called Joseph Nyman and Edwin Fogg. The two men called the police to see if there were any UFO reports from anyone else, but apparently there were not. They then headed over to the family's house to interview Steve directly. This is still the same night of the encounter. So getting there, Steve reported what happened, and after hearing about the beam of light striking his chest, the investigators asked if they could examine him physically. So Steve removed his shirt, and everyone was amazed to see a marking similar to a sunburn, which you can see here. It ran from the top of his breastbone, tracing a narrow line under both sides of his rib cage, kind of like an upside-down T-shape. The investigators asked and were granted permission to take a photograph of this strange burn mark, which was very similar to a sunburn. The boy said that there was no pain whatsoever associated with this mark. Now, Steve's parents knew that he would often talk in his sleep, particularly about events that had upset him during the day. So when Steve went to sleep a few hours later at 11:15 p.m., his parents were not surprised when he started mumbling about his encounter. His father quickly grabbed a tape recorder and recorded what the boy was saying. And the boy said, quote, "Oh no, what the hell? It's a UFO. What's happening? I don't want to go on. Don't do any more tests on me. Oh no, no, no. Don't do any more tests. Who are you? Are you an Earth person?" Later that night he spoke again in his sleep, saying, "No more tests. I have to get home. I'll be late for my scout meeting. Boy, what weird eyes you have. What weird hands." So waking up in the morning, the boy had no memory whatsoever of talking in his sleep. But in the days that followed, something else happened. Weird poltergeist-like activity began to occur in the house. These included lights going on and off, water faucets turning on and off, small objects moving by themselves, and it was clear to everyone that the boy himself was, quote, the agent, and that it was connected to his UFO encounter. Meanwhile, Steve was having flashbacks of being on board, strange dreams, anxiety, and a fear of going outside at night. So a few months later, Steve agreed to try hypnotic regression to recall further details of his encounter. And going under hypnosis, he did recall going outside, seeing the UFO, being struck by the beam of light and immobilized. He heard the mumbling in his head. However, now under hypnosis, he not only understood what was being said to him, he remembered being taken on board. As Steve says, "Something's telling me something. It's a calm voice running through my mind, soothing me. I don't understand. The ship comes closer. I'm able to run. I hit the baseball bat and fall down. I look up. It's looking at me. Something's looking at me still. No one could hear me. This is it. The light gets really intense. I won't be harmed. They're just going to examine me. It's a person. He has a big head, a small body. He's floating across the window of the ship. It's talking and looking at me. Then it stops. I can't understand it. I run and it just stays where it is. His eyes are big, nose long, no mouth. Now, despite his fear, Stephen says that the aliens were, quote, friendly, and that they just, quote, wanted to examine him. Writes researcher Joseph Nyman, 2 or 3 beings apparently ran medical tests on him. The most amazing thing you hear from these tapes is at the end of their conversation, the aliens tell the boy they'll be back. The investigators learned at the time of the encounter that the mother was in the middle of a custody battle for her son with the boy's natural father, so it was clear to the investigators that there was no motive for a hoax, because the family was very concerned about any publicity. So they were convinced of the genuineness of this case. As researcher Joseph Nyman writes, now, more than 17 years after the events, I am more than ever convinced of their reality and the case's importance of my own understanding of the nature of the UFO experience. Such an amazing case. And you can see that although the witness did undergo hypnotic regression, it stands up quite easily without it. And although he felt it was somewhat traumatic, he ultimately concluded that the ETs were in fact friendly. So that is a pattern I see with most contactees. It can be quite scary, but it becomes clear to the witnesses that the ETs are not trying to harm them or frighten them. And ultimately, often it just comes down to physical checkup. That seems to be the purpose of quite a few encounters. Now let's move to the next one, which definitely fits this pattern as well. I call this one, You Will Not Remember This. This occurred one evening in August of 1984 in Beckley, West Virginia. It is a single witness case. It hasn't been formally investigated as far as I know, but it's certainly a compelling first-hand eyewitness testimony of what it's like to be taken on board and undergo a physical examination by extraterrestrials. The witness in this case is anonymous, so I've given him the pseudonym Blaine. He reported his case to the National UFO Reporting Center, Newfork, about 15 years after it occurred, writing that he is, quote, a non-smoker, non-drinker, and I did and do not use drugs. At the time of his encounter, he was about 21 or 22 years old, living with his parents in their home in Beckley, West Virginia. And I'll just let Blaine describe what happened. As he says, I had just laid down when I heard a high-pitched whirring sound. Then an extremely bright light came through my window. I can remember grabbing my bed and trying to hold on because it felt like I was being absorbed into the light. The next thing I remember, I was lying on a bed or a table. The feel and look of the table was cold, and it had a gray porcelain look to it. It did not have legs, but the base came from the floor. I was covered with a thin silver blanket. It did not feel as if it were made from cloth. There were several beings standing beside the table. I believe 2 on one side and 3 on the other. On the side with the 3 beings, one stood by my head and tried to calm me as the others performed the procedures. He seemed to communicate telepathically. I do not remember him speaking to me directly. Now the ETs appear to be grays, although as Blaine says, I'm not sure of the color. As Blaine says, they were of medium height with 2 elongated eyes and a slit for a mouth. The ET standing next to him continued to speak telepathically and told him, You will not remember this. You will not be harmed. We are not trying to hurt you. However, as they proceeded to examine him, Blaine does report feeling some pain. As Blaine says, I remember this light above my head. It started at my head and slowly and extremely painfully moved down my body. I felt like I was being rolled by a rolling pin. When it got to my feet, I was in a lot of pain. I remember feeling like I was going to puke, as I was being told that they were going to make one more pass back up to my head. At that point I began pleading to be let go, that it was too painful, and I could not take it. So at this point, the being that was communicating with him and was reassuring him began to speak to one of the other beings who Blaine perceived to be the one in charge of the encounter, and Blaine had the impression that they were having a, quote, heated argument. Then the being by his head turned to Blaine and said something which shocked him. As Blaine says, he turned to me and told me that years earlier I had asked them to come, and that I would not resist. So Blaine's mind whirled with this information because he knew exactly what the being was talking about. As Blaine says, years earlier, I remember yelling into the sky with a friend and I wanted to meet the aliens, and I would be willing to be examined in a UFO. And now they were doing it, and he said I was whining about it. A few more words were exchanged with the boss, and the light began its trip back up. Now the being who was comforting Blaine then told him, "We are very sorry if we harmed you and scared you." That was enough for Blaine to become emotionally overwhelmed, and he believes that his fear of what was happening cut the encounter short. As Blaine says, "I lost it. I think they put me back before they had finished. I remember feeling the beam place me back in bed, and as I looked up, the light left my room. I was scared. I ran to my parents' room crying, and I went to some of the windows in the house to look outside." Blaine searched to see if there was any UFO in the sky, but he apparently did not see anything. And unfortunately, his parents did not believe him and just dismissed his story. But before long, Blaine was vindicated and received some level of confirmation of his experience because, as he says, a few days later on the news, a UFO was reported to have been seen in a city that was close to where I live. So this experience, as you can imagine, changed the way Blaine feels about UFOs and aliens, and today he has learned to live with his encounter as best as he can. As he says, "I have told only a few people, but we joke about it. However, I am tired of joking about it because it did happen. I remember it, and I have tried to avoid reading or watching anything that might embellish my abduction. I try to be calm and remember as much of it as I could because I knew no one would believe me." How interesting is that case? Yes, in many ways it is fairly typical. But what I find most interesting about that case is how the witness, as a young man, basically asked for an encounter, called out to them. And apparently the ETs remembered this because they brought it up. Technically, this would be categorized as a close encounter of the fifth kind, human-initiated, because he asked for an encounter and he got it. I guess the old adage, "Be careful what you wish for," is true. An amazing encounter. Now let's move to the next one, which I call an overwhelming feeling of love and compassion. This occurred on August 25, 1998 in Columbia, Tennessee. This case is so interesting to me because this witness really had an amazing emotional reaction to her encounter. This case comes from an anonymous witness who reported her encounter about 15 years after it occurred. She did provide her first-hand written testimony of what she believes was an onboard UFO encounter. For the purpose of this presentation, I've given her the pseudonym Charlotte. Her encounter occurred on August 25, 1998, where she was taken from her bedroom of her home in Columbia, Tennessee. As Charlotte says, "I was in bed asleep and awoke to floating out my bedroom window. The wind was blowing my gown. I saw myself at the treetops and reached to a limb to grab some leaves. They fell from my hand. I then realized a light was towards where I was floating. I looked to the path I was floating, and I saw a disc-shaped object above the trees. I was floating closer to the beam of light that was emitting from the bottom of the disc, and I was taken on board the craft." Now, Charlotte does not describe actually entering the craft. This is a phenomenon that researchers call doorway amnesia. Often people find themselves being pulled up towards a craft, and suddenly they're inside it. And this is exactly what Charlotte says happened to her. Says Charlotte, "The next thing I knew, I was on a table in a round room. It was very white in the room, and the light was of better quality than I have ever seen. I then saw 3 human-like creatures. One was below my feet, the second was at my right near my legs, and the third was at my left and up closer to me. I looked around at them. Then the one on my left took my hand. I was not afraid. I had an overwhelming feeling of love and compassion from this entity. We looked at each other in the eyes, and I felt totally relaxed and at ease. Suddenly a 4th entity came in that was taller than the rest. He came to my right side, just as a surgeon would do. The one at the right of me that was at my legs placed a thing on the 4th one's head. Now the device kind of reminded Charlotte of the children's toy, a Viewmaster, which allows the user to see various illuminated pictures. But seeing what happened next, it was clear to Charlotte that this instrument was a medical examination tool of some kind, because as Charlotte says, The taller one that had the gadget on his head pulled it down over his eyes, then bent down over my chest, and a small red beam emerged from the gadget and hit my chest. I felt pain and I could not breathe. I felt like I was passing out. I looked so closely into the eyes of the one that was the tallest, which I call the surgeon, and so closely into the eyes of the one on my left, which I call the anesthesiologist. I know they did not look like eyes. They looked like lenses of some sort. So this marked the end of Charlotte's onboard experience, or at least her memory of it. If anything else happened, she doesn't remember it. As Charlotte says, the next thing I know, I awake in my bed, sweating and feeling panic. Now at first, Charlotte told only a few people, but later felt that it was very important to report it officially. She has learned that some people are skeptical, but she is convinced that she was taken on board a craft and saw extraterrestrials who performed some kind of tests on her. As Charlotte says, I have not shared this story to but a few people, some of who looked at me like I was crazy. Some people have told me it was just a dream, but I feel it was real. I will always believe it was real. I will never forget it. I know that for sure. I wonder how many times this has happened to me and I don't remember, and what else have they done? What I find interesting about that case is that the witness really had difficulty processing it, trying to figure out, was this a dream? Could this have been a real experience? Obviously, she does think it's real because she reported it that way. Also super interesting is that she felt incredible love and compassion coming from these beings. This is reported far more often than you might think. It's funny because sometimes people will report, these ETs weren't very emotional. I think those are probably the little, small, short grays, which I think, honestly, are what we would call biological androids, AI, who aren't emotional, are not born, don't die. They're essentially biological machines. So it makes sense that they wouldn't have strong emotions. But yes, ETs absolutely do have emotions. And very commonly, people will report feeling an incredible sense of love coming from them. It's truly an astonishing case, and I'm glad the witness had the courage to report it in the face of this hostile climate of skepticism and disbelief and ridicule and gaslighting. Because again, so many people are having these experiences and only very few are coming forward. Now let's move to the last and final case, which to me is probably my favorite in this collection. This one is just really profound for a number of reasons. I call this one Our Alien Baby. This one occurred on November 30th, 2014 in Kilgore, Texas. And I think you'll find it a particularly fascinating and compelling case. The vast majority of people who have an onboard encounter do request anonymity, and this case is no exception. It involves a woman I'll call Kathleen. Again, that is a pseudonym. At the time of her encounter, she was living with her husband and young son in a rented home on a very large lot in the middle of the small town of Kilgore, Texas. Her husband had recently left the state for his job, so Kathleen was alone with her son, and the only neighbors around were the landlords who lived nearby on the same property. On the evening of November 30, 2014, she had put her son to sleep and then went to sleep herself. And that night, she had a very vivid and unusual dream. At least, that's what she thought it was at first. Later, she changed her mind. Because as Kathleen says, in the dream, there was a bright light, so bright that at first I couldn't see anything. It slowly dimmed, and I noticed right away I was strapped to a table in a medical gown of sorts. The table I was strapped to had broken apart for each of my limbs, so my legs were spread and my arms were spread, kind of like an X shape, with an extended part for my head to lay. I realized I couldn't move or speak at all, and I started to panic. But a female voice calmly assured me that I was going to be okay and that they weren't going to hurt me. I didn't hear a voice as if spoken out loud. It was only in my head. I don't know how, because I could not see her, but I felt her standing right behind me. Off to the right of me stood 3 little gray beings, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, the typical-looking grays society knows. So at this point, the grays started to examine her body, touching her and performing some kind of procedure. As Kathleen says, I assumed the female being had given them instructions I didn't hear, because they started touching me, and although I couldn't feel it, I could see them. One came around the table to my left and opened my gown so my stomach was exposed. One of the ones on my right stood there, while the other pulled something towards me. It was a machine of some sort. When I looked up, I saw a metal ring, and in the middle of it was a needle. The machine lowered, and the needle extended, and they hovered it right over my navel. I didn't feel it, but I saw it when the needle went straight into my belly button. The female voice kept assuring me that they weren't hurting me, and for some reason I believed her. I don't know why. Once they were done with whatever they were doing, they closed my gown. Now at this point Kathleen had seen only the small grays, but now she saw a being which was very different looking and quite frightening for her. As Kathleen says, I was able to look down towards the end of the table, and I saw a massive creature that horrified me. It was so tall that its head was ducked so that it didn't touch the metal ceiling. It was light and dark brown with some black patterns here and there on its body, and it had a face that I can only compare to the head of a praying mantis, though it had a normal body with a normal torso, arms, and legs. It also had these extended appendages, like spider legs, that jutted out from both sides of him. So at this point Kathleen blacked out, and the next thing she knew, it was morning. She got up and fed her son. She lay him down for his nap and went to take a shower, still thinking about this, quote, dream. While in the shower, she was washing her navel, and this is when she noticed a little scab. Puzzled, she picked at it, and it started to bleed a little bit. And as Kathleen says, there was no explanation as to why it could have been there. I had never had any surgeries or anything in my life, especially within my belly button. I called my husband and told him about the dream, and he agreed it sounded crazy. Now it was just a short time later that Kathleen and her husband got amazing news. As Kathleen says, it was about a month later that we found out we were 6 weeks pregnant with our second son. Now Kathleen feels certain that there is a connection between her second son and the alien encounter. As she says, to this day, he is extremely smart, almost a genius, we'd say, and we don't say that just because he is our son. We joke to each other all the time about how he is our alien baby, because we honestly feel like they did something to our pregnancy. Kathleen says that her blood type is Rh negative, and she was surprised to hear that many contactees have this same blood type. She later had 2 other children and realized that the pregnancy with her second son was far different than the 3 others. As Kathleen says, I have major complications with my pregnancies. I have 4 children, and 3 of the pregnancies were horrible due to my health issues from my blood type. I had to take Rogam shots to ensure my baby's safety, so my body wouldn't kill it. My second son's pregnancy was the only one I did not have to take medications or shots with. He was the only healthy pregnancy I've had. So Kathleen now feels the urge to talk to others about her case and recently reported it to MUFON and elsewhere. As Kathleen says, I was invited to talk on a podcast about my encounter, and I did just that to spread awareness and share my story. I've met others with similar stories since then. I waited too long to share my story because those closest to me that I did tell thought I was crazy and didn't believe me and shrugged it off as if it was nothing. How interesting is that? It does appear that the ETs intervened with this woman's pregnancy, it being the only pregnancy of 4, which was actually caused her no problems. It's really interesting because she has the Rh negative blood type, which does seem to be a bit more prominent among the contactee population. But yeah, she had really difficult pregnancies with all the other children except this one. She had physical evidence that there was an encounter, so I do think that she was absolutely taken on board and this wasn't a dream, particularly because how her baby turned out to be a little bit different from all the others. Yes, I think they are to some extent joking when they say, oh, he's our alien baby. But we see this pattern over and over again with people who are taken on board while they're pregnant, and then the baby comes out and he's just a little bit more psychic or intelligent or outgoing than the other children in the family. So I find that case to be particularly interesting for those reasons, because it's a pattern we see so often. So there you go. 8 cases of onboard UFO encounters. I'm sure there are millions of people who are having this experience all over the world. And yes, they can be frightening, but as these cases show, I think if you take an objective look, not through the lens of fear, disregarding your prior beliefs about what's going on here and just looking at the actual sequence of events, it's very encouraging. I don't think, again, that we have any reason to worry about these kinds of experiences. ETs have been around forever, pretty much since when we started recording history, and very likely before that. So I don't buy into the fear narrative that our governments or secret governments are putting forth, that this is something we should fear. I don't think that's the case at all. And I can tell you that the vast majority of contactees also feel the same way. Certainly not all of them. But I think if ETs were truly our enemies, we would know it by now. So there you go. You can make up your own minds about all of this. I am simply reporting the facts as we know them. So I truly appreciate you guys tuning in and watching. I absolutely appreciate your support as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the answers. Most important of all, keep having fun. I'll see you next time on another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Signing off.